In 1596, Dutch ships first arrived in the Indonesian archipelago, drawn by the allure of the spice trade. At that time, nutmeg, cloves, and pepper were more valuable than gold in Europe, and Indonesia's Maluku Islands held the world's richest supply. The Dutch, unlike the Portuguese before them, came with powerful fleets and advanced naval strategies. Their purpose was not just to trade, but to dominate and monopolize these precious spices. By 1602, the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, was founded, a unique entity that combined business with military power. The VOC built fortified trading posts and gradually expanded, clashing with local kingdoms that resisted foreign control. Instead of equal trade, the Dutch imposed ruthless contracts, forcing local rulers to sell only to them. Villages that refused were burned, and thousands of people were enslaved or killed in the process. In 1619, the VOC attacked and destroyed the city of Jayakarta, burning it to the ground and rebuilding it as Batavia, the new capital of their colonial empire. Batavia became a hub of power from where the Dutch launched campaigns of expansion, tightening their grip across the islands. It was the birth of a colony that would last over 300 years. The VOC's primary goal was to control the spice trade completely. To achieve this, the Dutch used ruthless strategies, particularly in the Banda Islands, the only place on Earth where nutmeg grew naturally. In 1621, Jan Pieterszoon Cohen led a massacre of the Bandanese people, wiping out most of the population and replacing them with enslaved laborers and Dutch settlers. This horrific event secured Dutch monopoly over nutmeg. The VOC also waged wars against powerful kingdoms such as Mataram and Makassar. These wars were brutal, often involving scorched earth tactics, where rice fields were destroyed and villages starved into surrender. Over time, many local rulers were forced into treaties, becoming vassals to the Dutch. Indonesia's economy was reshaped, not for the benefit of its people, but for European markets. By the 18th century, the VOC had become immensely wealthy, but corruption, mismanagement, and constant wars drained its power. Local resistance never fully disappeared, and combined with bankruptcy, the VOC was dissolved in 1799. Its possessions were handed over to the Dutch crown, marking the beginning of direct colonial rule by the Netherlands. In the 19th century, the Netherlands imposed even harsher systems to exploit Indonesia. The cultivation system, Kulturstelsel, was introduced in 1830, forcing peasants to dedicate large portions of their land to cash crops like coffee, sugar, and indigo. This system caused widespread famine and suffering, as farmers could no longer grow enough rice for themselves. Millions of Javanese people died of starvation, while the Netherlands became one of the richest countries in Europe. Despite the oppression, the 19th century also saw the first sparks of Indonesian resistance. Leaders such as Prince Diponegoro in Java waged fierce wars against Dutch rule. The Java War, 1825 to 1830, became one of the bloodiest conflicts, costing hundreds of thousands of lives. Though Diponegoro was eventually captured, his struggle inspired later generations to dream of freedom. By the late 19th century, Dutch control extended across most of the archipelago. Yet, cracks were forming. Criticism of colonial brutality grew even within the Netherlands. Ethical concerns gave rise to the so-called ethical policy, but in practice, exploitation continued. Still, this policy unintentionally opened schools for Indonesians, planting the seeds of a new educated elite who would one day lead the independence movement. World War I and the global economic depression weakened Dutch control further. The spread of modern ideas, newspapers, and education fueled nationalist thought. Writers and activists began openly criticizing colonialism, inspiring more Indonesians to resist. By the 1930s, nationalism had become a powerful force. Leaders like Sukarno and Hatta were imprisoned, but their words lived on. The Dutch could sense the beginning of the end, though they still clung to their empire with military might. When World War II spread to Asia, the Japanese set their sights on the Dutch East Indies, lured by its oil, rubber, and rich natural resources. In early 1942, Japanese forces launched a lightning-fast invasion. The Dutch colonial army, poorly prepared and undermanned, collapsed almost instantly. Batavia fell without much resistance, and the Dutch surrendered in humiliation. For Indonesians, the fall of Dutch power was shocking. Centuries of colonial dominance had crumbled in mere weeks. At first, many Indonesians saw the Japanese as liberators. Unlike the aloof Dutch, the Japanese addressed Indonesians as brothers and promised an Asia free from Western colonialism. Nationalists such as Sukarno and Muhammad Hatta were brought forward and given limited platforms to speak. Mass rallies filled with patriotic songs and the waving of red and white banners created a fleeting sense of pride. But beneath the surface, it quickly became clear that Japanese promises masked a new, harsher occupation. The Japanese occupation soon revealed its brutality. Food shortages spread as rice was requisitioned for Japan's war effort. Millions of Indonesians were forced into unpaid labor, known as romusha, building railways, roads, and airfields in horrific conditions. Many perished from disease, exhaustion, and abuse. For villagers, life under the Japanese was harsher than under the Dutch. The new rulers demanded total obedience, using torture and intimidation to maintain control. Yet paradoxically, the occupation planted the seeds of independence. The Japanese allowed Indonesians to organize paramilitary youth groups and cultural associations. Nationalist leaders, though carefully monitored, used these platforms to spread the dream of a free Indonesia. Sukarno and Hatta inspired thousands, urging them to see beyond Japanese propaganda and prepare for a future without colonial masters. In schools and secret meetings, the idea of self-rule grew stronger. By 1944, Japan's empire was crumbling. Allied forces advanced through the Pacific, and whispers of defeat spread across the islands. The Japanese grew harsher, exploiting resources to fuel their failing war. Indonesians endured famine and repression, but also sensed opportunity. If Japan fell, who would rule the archipelago? The Dutch were weakened and humiliated. Nationalists quietly prepared to seize the moment when the Japanese grip loosened. In August 1945, Japan surrendered after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Suddenly, a power vacuum gripped Indonesia. The Dutch were not yet able to return, and Japan, defeated, could no longer maintain control. For the first time in centuries, Indonesians stood without a foreign master hovering over them. Within this fragile moment, nationalists saw their chance. Sukarno and Hatta moved swiftly, supported by youth movements demanding immediate independence. The Japanese, reluctant but powerless, allowed nationalist leaders to speak to the people. For ordinary Indonesians, it was a moment of cautious hope. They had endured Dutch exploitation and Japanese brutality. Now, for the first time, the possibility of self-rule glimmered on the horizon. The stage was set for the birth of a new nation. On August 17, 1945, Sukarno and Hatta stood before the people of Jakarta and declared Indonesia's independence. Though Japan had fallen, its collapse gave Indonesians the moment they needed. The proclamation rang out, not just in the capital, but across the islands. Villagers, workers, and fighters raised the red and white flag with tears and cheers. Indonesia had taken its first breath as a free nation, though its struggle had only just begun. The ink on the proclamation was barely dry when danger loomed again. The Dutch, humiliated by Japan and desperate to reclaim their colony, returned with Allied backing. They claimed they were restoring order, but Indonesians knew it meant the return of chains. Villagers, students, and workers armed themselves with bamboo spears, ready to defend the fragile newborn republic against an empire unwilling to let go. The fragile hope of independence shattered in November 1945, when Surabaya became the stage for one of the bloodiest battles in Indonesian history. Sparked by a violent clash with British forces supporting the Dutch, the city erupted into war. Young men, many still in their teens, armed themselves with bamboo spears, stolen rifles, and sheer determination. Against tanks, warplanes, and artillery, they fought street by street, alley by alley. Entire neighborhoods went up in flames as houses became fortresses and every corner turned into a battlefield. Mothers wept as their sons fell, yet still the fighters pressed on, refusing to surrender. Though the Indonesians were ultimately overwhelmed, the courage displayed in Surabaya ignited the nation. The city became a legend, a burning beacon that told the world Indonesia would not kneel without a fight. After Surabaya, the war transformed into a long and grinding struggle. Indonesian fighters abandoned open battles and vanished into jungles, mountains, and villages. Guerrilla warfare became their weapon. Swift ambushes, sabotaged railways, and sudden strikes on Dutch convoys. At night, resistance fighters slipped through the misty forests, laying explosives on bridges and vanishing before dawn. Villagers became their lifeline, offering food, shelter, and secrecy, despite the terrible risk. Dutch reprisals were swift and brutal. Villages burned, families executed, crops destroyed. Yet, with each act of violence, the Dutch drove the people closer to the Republic. The jungles of Java and Sumatra became a living shield, an endless battlefield where the Dutch could march but never truly conquer. While blood was spilled in villages and jungles, another war was fought at the negotiating table. The Dutch, under international pressure, signed agreements with Indonesian leaders, promising peace and recognition. But each promise was broken. In 1947, and again in 1948, they launched massive offensives known as police actions. These were no mere police operations. They were full-scale invasions. Warplanes bombarded towns, troops marched into the countryside, and villages were set ablaze. Sukarno, Hatta, and other leaders were captured and imprisoned, but their calm defiance only inspired more resistance. Every betrayal exposed Dutch arrogance. Every offensive fueled international condemnation. The Republic was wounded, but not broken. If guns and bombs defined the battlefield, the quiet defiance of ordinary Indonesians defined the revolution itself. Students scrawled independence slogans across city walls under cover of night. Farmers hid guerrillas in rice barns, even as Dutch patrols scoured the countryside. Women smuggled pistols and grenades in market baskets, their calm faces hiding the danger beneath. Underground newspapers printed stories of resistance victories, keeping hope alive in every village. Every act of daily life became a subtle rebellion. A whispered message, a hidden flag, a secret hand clasped in the street. The Republic did not survive only in its fighters. It lived in its people, whose courage was woven into the fabric of daily struggle. By 1948, the Dutch faced a reality they could no longer deny. Their economy was crippled, their soldiers weary, and their empire crumbling. Reports of massacres and atrocities reached the global stage, drawing condemnation from the newly formed United Nations. The United States, wary of communist influence in Southeast Asia during the Cold War, pressured the Dutch to withdraw. Dutch propaganda painted Indonesia as incapable of self-rule, but the truth was clear: the Republic was alive, and the Dutch grip was slipping. Diplomacy and global politics now worked in Indonesia's favor, pushing the Dutch into a corner they could not escape. On December 27, 1949, the impossible became reality. In The Hague, under the eyes of the world, the Netherlands formally transferred sovereignty to Indonesia. At last, the archipelago was free. Across the islands, people filled the streets, waving flags and weeping tears of joy. In Jakarta, fireworks lit the night sky as veterans embraced one another, remembering fallen comrades. Dutch soldiers boarded ships, departing in silence, their empire reduced to memory. For Indonesia, independence was more than political. It was the reclaiming of dignity, of identity, of the right to exist as a free people. The struggle had cost countless lives. Fighters in the jungles, families in massacred villages, children lost to famine and war. But out of the ashes rose a republic united in sacrifice and vision. For centuries, Indonesians had been silenced, but now their voices filled the air with songs of freedom. The nation began to rebuild, carrying scars, yet walking proudly into the future. Independence was not merely the end of colonialism. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one written by Indonesians themselves. The red and white flag now fluttered not as a dream, but as a living reality.